There are moments in life when everything you thought you knew about kindness gets turned upside down. Sometimes the person who saves you is the last one you'd ever expect. Pregnant widow Astrid was dying in the snow outside a Norwegian village. Her husband was dead, killed by raiders, and the townspeople wouldn't help her. She was starving, alone, and carrying a child she might never live to hold. That's when Halvar found her, a giant Viking warrior that most people feared to even look at. This man had spent years fighting brutal wars in distant lands. He was covered in scars and wrapped in silence. Everyone in the village crossed the street when they saw him coming. But when he saw Astrid collapsed in the dirt, he didn't walk past like everyone else. He knelt down beside her and spoke words that would change both their lives forever. What could make the most feared warrior in the village risk everything for a dying stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The iron ring on Astrid's finger had grown loose over the past months, hanging like a promise that might slip away at any moment. She twisted it absently as she remembered the day Eric had placed it there, his calloused hands gentle despite years wielding sword and axe. That ring was all she had left of the life they'd planned together, a life that ended in blood and screaming on an autumn morning she would never forget. Back then, she had been the blacksmith's daughter, with rosy cheeks and strong arms from working the bellows. Eric was the young hunter who brought his arrowheads for sharpening and stayed longer each time, finding excuses to linger near her forge. Their courtship had been simple and honest: walks along the fjord at sunset, shared meals with her father, promises spoken under starlight about the farm they would build and the children they would raise. The wedding had been modest but joyful. The whole village of Skjorn had celebrated with them, sharing ale and stories late into the night. Old Bjorn the fisherman had played his wooden flute while the women danced. Eric's mother had wept with happiness, pressing her own mother's silver brooch into Astrid's palm as a wedding gift. Even stern Aldrich, the village elder, had smiled that night and blessed their union with words about prosperity and many sons. For 2 years, their life had unfolded exactly as they'd dreamed. Eric proved skilled at both hunting and farming, bringing home game while tending their small plot of barley and turnips. Astrid kept their home warm and welcoming, her bread praised throughout the village. When she discovered she was with child, Eric had lifted her off her feet and spun her around their little yard, laughing like a boy on Midsummer's Eve. But happiness, Astrid had learned, could be as fragile as spring ice. The raiders had come from the east, following the river route that connected their peaceful valley to the wider world. They were different from the occasional bandits who sometimes troubled lone travelers. These men moved with military precision, striking 3 settlements in as many days. By the time word reached Skjorn, it was too late to flee. Eric had been among the first to fall, cut down while defending the grain storehouse. Astrid had watched from their doorway, 6 months heavy with child, as the man she loved bled out in the dirt he'd worked so hard to cultivate. The raiders had taken everything: livestock, grain, silver, even the iron tools from her father's forge. But they'd left something behind, a village full of people looking for someone to blame. In the days that followed, the whispers began. If Eric hadn't been so eager to fight, maybe the raiders would have taken what they wanted and left. If Astrid hadn't been pregnant, maybe he wouldn't have been so desperate to prove himself. The logic made no sense, but grief rarely did. People needed someone to point at when their world cracked apart, and a young widow with no family left to defend her made an easy target. First, they stopped sharing their surplus food. Then they avoided her at the well. Old friends would cross the street rather than acknowledge her presence. When she grew too weak to tend Eric's plot alone, they divided it among themselves, claiming the land needed strong hands to work it. By winter's first snowfall, Astrid was surviving on turnip peels and the occasional fish she could catch in the shallows. But it was the cold that truly threatened to kill her now. The villagers had stopped bringing firewood months ago, and she'd burned everything she could: Eric's extra clothes, their marriage chest, even the wooden toys he'd been carving for their unborn child. Last night, she'd seriously considered burning the wooden cross Eric had hung above their bed, but something in her rebelled against that final surrender. This morning, she'd collapsed while trying to reach the well. The baby had been restless all night, kicking and turning as if it too sensed their desperate straits. Her vision had greyed at the edges, and her legs simply refused to carry her another step. She'd managed to crawl to the side of the road before the world tilted sideways and darkness crept in. That's where Halvar had found her. The giant Viking's reputation had preceded his return to Skjorn by several months. Tales of his exploits in the eastern campaigns had filtered back through traders and travelling skalds, stories of cities taken, armies routed, treasures claimed in service to jarls and kings whose names were whispered rather than spoken aloud. They said he'd sailed beyond the great rivers, into lands where the sun barely set in summer and barely rose in winter. They said he'd fought beside berserkers and against demons, that his sword had drunk the blood of 100 enemies. But it was the darker stories that made the villagers cross themselves when his name was mentioned. They spoke of the madness that sometimes took warriors who'd seen too much death, the way such men could turn on friend as quickly as foe. They said Halvar had returned alone from his last campaign, the only survivor of a company that had numbered 30 good men. No one knew exactly what had happened in those distant lands, but the haunted look in his eyes and the fresh scars covering his massive frame told a story of battles best left unspoken. When he'd first returned to Skjorn, Halvar had made no effort to reintegrate into village life. He'd claimed a small, abandoned steading on the settlement's outskirts and kept to himself. The few times he'd appeared in the village proper had been for necessities: grain, ale, iron for his weapons. He spoke little, paid in silver, and left quickly. The children fled when they saw him coming. The women clutched their cloaks tighter. Even the men, warriors in their own right, seemed smaller in his presence. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, Halvar was an imposing figure even in repose. His hair hung past his shoulders in the warrior's style, streaked with premature silver that spoke of hard campaigns and harder choices. Scars mapped the visible portions of his body like a chronicle written in flesh: the puckered mark of an arrow on his left shoulder, the thin line of a blade across his jawbone, the twisted flesh of his right hand where fire had touched him. His eyes, pale blue like winter ice, seemed to look through people rather than at them, as if he were seeing something else entirely. The foreign blade at his hip marked him as a man who'd travelled far from home. Its curved design and intricate metalwork spoke of Eastern craftsmanship, won in battle or trade from lands most villagers couldn't imagine. The weapon was beautiful and deadly in equal measure, much like the man who carried it. But it was what Halvar had done when he found Astrid that changed everything. She'd awakened to find herself lifted from the snow as easily as a child, cradled against a chest broad as a tree trunk. Through half-conscious eyes she'd seen his scarred face above her, those cold blue eyes suddenly warm with something she couldn't name. He'd spoken no words of comfort or explanation, simply carried her to his steading and laid her carefully on the furs beside his hearth. The warmth had been almost painful after so long in the cold. She'd tried to speak, to thank him or protest or ask why, but he'd placed one massive finger against her lips and shaken his head gently. Then he'd busied himself building up the fire, heating broth in an iron pot, moving about his simple home with surprising grace for such a large man. When he'd finally offered her food, real food, not scraps or peels but honest meat and vegetables, Astrid had wept. Not from gratitude, though she felt that deeply, but from the simple human kindness of it. After months of being treated as if she were already dead, someone had seen her as worth saving. Halvar had watched her eat without speaking, his pale eyes unreadable. When she'd finally worked up the courage to ask why he'd helped her, his answer had been simple and profound. Every life deserves protecting, he'd said in a voice roughened by years of battle commands, especially one that carries another. His gaze had moved to her swollen belly with something approaching reverence. This man who'd made his living dealing death seemed awed by the life growing within her. The contradiction should have been jarring, but somehow it felt right. Who better to understand the value of life than someone who'd seen so much of it snuffed out? That first night, Astrid had slept better than she had in months. Not just because of the warmth and food, though those certainly helped, but because of the quiet presence of her protector. Halvar had taken the first watch, sitting by the door with that foreign blade across his knees, alert for any threat. When she'd awakened briefly in the dark hours before dawn, she'd seen him still there, sentinel still, and utterly focused on keeping her safe. The village's reaction to this development had been swift and predictable. By morning, 3 different neighbors had found excuses to walk past Halvar's steading, peering through his windows to confirm what their eyes could hardly believe. By midday, the story had spread through Skjorn like wildfire. The ghost warrior had taken in the cursed widow. No good could come of it. Elder Aldrich himself had arrived that afternoon, flanked by 2 younger men whose hands rested meaningfully on their sword hilts. The confrontation had been brief but telling. Through the half-open door, Astrid had heard the elders' demands that Halvar surrender her to proper village justice, meaning abandonment in the wilderness to die. She'd also heard Halvar's response, delivered in tones so cold and final that the very air seemed to freeze. "She is under my protection now," he'd said. "Any who wish to challenge that are welcome to try." The silence that followed had stretched long enough for Astrid to count her own heartbeats. When Elder Aldrich finally spoke again, his voice carried a tremor it hadn't held in years. "This won't end well, Halvar. The gods don't favor those who shelter the marked." "The gods," Halvar had replied with quiet conviction, "favor those who protect the innocent. Test me if you think otherwise." The delegation had left without another word. But Astrid knew, as surely as she knew her own name, that this was only the beginning. The village would not tolerate her presence indefinitely, and they would certainly not allow Halvar to challenge their collective judgment without consequences. Whatever came next would likely force them both to make choices that would change their lives forever. 3 days after Elder Aldrich's visit, the village council convened at dawn. The ancient staff of office, carved from ash wood and topped with iron runes, lay across the elder's knees as he called the assembly to order. That staff had governed Skjorn for 5 generations, passed down through blood and wisdom, its decisions final as winter frost. Today, it would seal Astrid's fate. Halvar had known this moment would come. He'd seen the furtive glances, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when he approached. The village had made its collective decision, and they would formalize it with all the weight of tradition behind them. He'd faced armies with less trepidation than he felt, watching that gathering of familiar faces turn hostile. From his steading, he could see the villagers assembling in the common area beside the great hall. Men he'd known since boyhood stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions grim with purpose. Women who'd once smiled when he passed clutched their shawls tighter and avoided his gaze. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, huddling close to their parents instead of running free as they usually did. Inside his home, Astrid stirred restlessly on the furs. Her pregnancy had progressed visibly in just these few days of proper nourishment, her belly rounding fuller now that she had food to sustain both herself and the child. But the stress of uncertainty showed in the tight lines around her eyes and the way her hands unconsciously protected her stomach whenever voices grew loud outside. "They're deciding what to do with me," she said quietly, not really asking. Halvar nodded, checking the edge on his blade out of habit rather than necessity. The foreign steel gleamed in the morning light, filtering through his single window, its curved surface reflecting distorted images of the room. He'd carried this weapon through battles whose names were spoken only in hushed tones, but he'd never drawn it to protect something as precious as the woman and unborn child behind him. "What will you do when they come?" Astrid asked, struggling to sit up despite the weight of her pregnancy. "What I must," he replied simply. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the council's arrival before they came into view. Elder Aldrich led the procession, the ceremonial staff striking the ground with each measured step. Behind him walked the village's most prominent men, Bjorn the fisherman, Gunnar the merchant, Sven who owned the largest farm. Their faces bore the solemn weight of men carrying out an unpleasant but necessary duty. Halvar stepped outside to meet them, closing the door firmly behind him. The morning air carried the bite of approaching winter, and his breath steamed as he stood before the assembled delegation. Despite being outnumbered 6-1, he dominated the space through sheer presence, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to reach toward the villagers like dark fingers. Elder Aldrich raised the staff, its iron runes catching the pale sunlight. When he spoke, his voice carried the formal cadence of ritual pronouncement. "Halvar Eriksson, son of this village, we come with the collective will of Skjorn's people." "Speak your peace," Halvar replied, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "The woman you harbor has brought misfortune upon our community. Her husband's death, the raiders' attack, the poor harvest, all trace back to the curse she carries. The gods have marked her for abandonment, and we will not share in her doom." Astrid had pressed herself against the door, listening to every word through the wooden planks. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she heard her life reduced to superstition and blame. The child within her seemed to sense her distress, shifting restlessly as if trying to escape the growing tension. "You speak of curses," Halvar said, his voice deadly quiet. "I see only fear dressed up as righteousness." Gunnar stepped forward, his merchant's confidence wavering slightly under Halvar's stare. "The council has voted. She must leave Skjorn's protection by sunset, or we will drive her out ourselves. And if she's too weak to travel? If the journey kills her and the child?" Elder Aldrich's grip tightened on the staff. "That is the gods' will to decide, not ours. We cannot risk the entire village for one woman's fate." Halvar studied each face in turn, memorizing the men who would condemn a pregnant woman to death rather than face their own mortality. These were people he'd grown up alongside, shared ale with, fought beside when bandits threatened their borders. Now they stood before him like strangers, their humanity buried beneath layers of fear and superstition. "You want her gone," he said finally. "Very well. But understand this: where she goes, I go." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled group. Bjorn's mouth fell open. Gunnar took an involuntary step backward. Even Elder Aldrich seemed momentarily stunned by this unexpected development. "You would abandon your birthright for a woman you barely know?" the elder asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "My birthright?" Halvar's laugh held no humor. "What birthright?" "A place among people who would let a pregnant woman starve in the snow. I've seen enough death in foreign lands without watching it happen in my own dooryard." Inside the steading, Astrid pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. He was willing to leave everything: his home, his heritage, his place in the world, to protect her. The sacrifice was too great, too overwhelming to comprehend fully. Sven, the farmer, tried one last appeal to reason. "Halvar, be sensible. Your father was a good man, respected here. You have land, status, a future. Don't throw it all away for sentiment." "My father," Halvar said softly, "would have been ashamed to see what this village has become." He drew his foreign blade in one smooth motion, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. "But he would have been proud to see me do what's right." The villagers flinched backward collectively, hands moving to their own weapons. But Halvar made no threatening gesture, simply held the blade point down in the earth like a standard planted in defiance. "This is my answer to your counsel," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Astrid is under my protection. Any who wish to challenge that protection can face me here and now, sword to sword, as our fathers did when honor still meant something." The silence stretched taut as bowstring. 6 men faced one, but that one was Halvar Eriksson, whose reputation had grown to legendary proportions during his years abroad. Stories of his prowess in battle had been told and retold until they'd taken on mythic qualities. None of the villagers, whatever their numbers, seemed eager to test those stories personally. Elder Aldrich finally broke the silence, his voice heavy with regret and resignation. "So be it. By sunset, both of you will be beyond Skjorn's borders. After that, you are strangers to us, with no claim on our aid or protection." "We ask for none," Halvar replied, sheathing his blade with the same fluid grace he'd drawn it. As the delegation turned to leave, Elder Aldrich paused and looked back. For a moment, the official mask slipped, revealing the old man's genuine sorrow. "I knew your father well, boy. He was a good friend and a better man. This path you're choosing, he wouldn't have wanted this for you." Halvar met the elder's gaze without flinching. "My father taught me to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. I think he'd understand better than you imagine." After the villagers departed, Halvar remained outside for several minutes, breathing deeply of the cold morning air. When he finally entered his steading, he found Astrid sitting on the edge of the sleeping firs, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "I can go alone. I won't let you sacrifice everything for me." Halvar knelt beside her, his massive hands gentle as he wiped the tears from her cheeks. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply, "and it's no sacrifice to leave a place that's forgotten what honor means." That afternoon, they prepared for departure with methodical efficiency. Halvar packed his few belongings, weapons, tools, a small store of silver earned in foreign service. Astrid gathered what remained of her possessions, which fit easily into a single leather satchel. The iron wedding ring stayed on her finger, Eric's memory travelling with them into an uncertain future. As sunset approached, they stood together at the threshold of the only home Halvar had ever known. Behind them lay everything familiar and safe. Ahead stretched unknown roads and winter's growing bite. But as Astrid's hand found his, Halvar felt something he hadn't experienced in years, purpose beyond mere survival. "Where will we go?" she asked, adjusting her cloak against the evening chill. "Away from here," he replied, shouldering his pack. "Somewhere the past can't follow, and the future belongs to us." Together, they walked into the gathering dusk, leaving Skjorn's lights behind them like stars going out one by one. The hunting knife tucked into Astrid's belt had been Eric's most prized possession after his axe. Its bone handle bore the smooth wear of constant use, and its steel edge had gutted countless deer and wild boar during their brief marriage. She touched it unconsciously as they walked, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. It was the last, tangible piece of her husband she carried, and she wasn't ready to let that go, even as her heart slowly opened to the possibility of a different future. 3 days out from Skjorn, their journey had settled into a careful rhythm dictated by Astrid's condition and the unforgiving terrain. Halvar matched his stride to hers without complaint, his warrior's impatience tempered by genuine concern for her welfare. When she needed to rest, he found sheltered spots and built small fires. When the path grew too rough, he scouted alternate routes that favored gentleness over speed. The morning mist clung to the valleys like smoke from ancient battles, and their breath formed white clouds in the crisp air. Winter was coming early this year. They could both feel it in the way the wind cut through their cloaks and how the ground crunched beneath their feet, even when no frost was visible. Each day brought them farther from everything familiar, deeper into wilderness that recognized no villages or councils, where survival depended on skill and fortune rather than social standing. "Tell me about him," Halvar said quietly, as they paused beside a small stream to refill their water skins. He'd been watching Astrid's hand move to the knife throughout the morning, recognizing the gesture of someone clinging to precious memory. Astrid looked up from where she'd been rinsing her face in the cold water. For a moment, she seemed ready to deflect the question, but something in Halvar's patient expression encouraged honesty instead. Eric was gentle, she said finally. Not weak. He could work all day without tiring and face down a charging boar without flinching, but gentle in ways that mattered. He never raised his voice to me, never made me feel small or foolish for my thoughts. She dried her hands on her cloak, eyes distant with remembering. He had this way of listening, really listening, when I spoke. Most men, she paused, glancing at Halvar with sudden embarrassment. Most men hear only what they expect to hear, Halvar finished, settling onto a fallen log nearby. Go on. He carved things when his hands were idle. Little animals, patterns in wood, toys for children that didn't exist yet but that he hoped would someday. Her voice caught slightly. He was making a rocking horse when the raiders came. I found the pieces afterward, scattered in our yard like broken promises. Halvar said nothing, understanding that some griefs needed space to breathe before they could heal. The stream gurgled softly between them, carrying away secrets and sorrows toward distant seas. What will you tell the child about him? Halvar asked eventually. The truth, Astrid said without hesitation, that his father was a good man who died protecting what he loved. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to stand firm despite it. Much like someone else I've come to know. The compliment hung between them, unexpected and profound. Halvar felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with exertion or the weak sun filtering through the trees. When was the last time someone had seen past his reputation to the man beneath? When had anyone looked at him and seen courage rather than simply violence? Eric sounds like he was worthy of being remembered, Halvar said quietly. He was. Astrid's hand moved to her belly, where the baby had been unusually active since dawn. This child will know about honor and gentleness because of him, but it will also know about protection and strength because of you. They resumed walking after that, but the conversation had changed something fundamental between them. Where before there had been careful gratitude on her part and duty on his, now there was the beginning of genuine understanding. They were both carrying losses, both trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their previous lives. The path grew steeper as they climbed toward a ridge that promised a view of the valley beyond. Astrid's breathing became labored, and she had to stop more frequently to rest. Each time, Halvar waited without complaint, using the pauses to scout ahead or check their back trail for signs of pursuit. He'd seen no evidence they were being followed, but years of warfare had taught him that survival often depended on assuming the worst. During one such rest, Astrid watched him move through the forest like a shadow despite his massive size. His awareness was constant and complete, noting wind direction, animal sounds, the subtle changes in light that might indicate weather shifts. This was a man who'd lived on the knife's edge for so long that vigilance had become second nature. What were the eastern lands like? She asked, when he returned to her side. Halvar considered the question, his pale eyes growing distant. Different, he said finally. Cities that stretched beyond the horizon, rivers wider than fjords, people who spoke in tongues that sounded like music even when they were cursing you. Did you like it there? A shadow crossed his features. I was good at what I needed to do there. Whether I liked it. He shrugged. A soldier doesn't have the luxury of preferences. You go where you're sent, fight when you're told, and try to come home with honor intact. But you came home alone, Astrid said gently. Yes. The word fell like a stone into deep water. I came home alone. She didn't press for details, understanding that some stories needed time and trust before they could be shared. Instead, she focused on the steady strength of his presence beside her, the way he positioned himself between her and any potential threat without making it seem deliberate or dramatic. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they created their first proper camp. Halvar selected a spot sheltered by overhanging rocks with good sightlines and access to water. He built their fire with the efficiency of long practice, arranging stones to reflect heat and conceal light from casual observation. When Astrid offered to help with preparations, he gently redirected her toward rest instead. "You're carrying enough burden," he said, stirring the pot of stew he'd assembled from their supplies. "Let me carry this one." They ate in comfortable silence as darkness gathered around their small circle of warmth. The baby kicked energetically, making Astrid's belly ripple with movement. She caught Halvar watching the phenomenon with something approaching awe. "Feel," she said impulsively, reaching for his hand. Halvar hesitated, his scarred fingers hovering inches from her rounded stomach. "I don't want to. You won't hurt us," Astrid assured him, placing his palm against her belly. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick directly against Halvar's hand. His entire expression transformed, wonder replacing the careful mask he usually wore. Here was life in its purest form, determined, vital, completely unaware of the dangers surrounding it. "Strong," he murmured, his voice soft with amazement. "Like his protector," Astrid replied, covering his hand with both of hers. When they settled down to sleep, Astrid on the furs closest to the fire and Halvar keeping watch nearby, something fundamental had shifted between them. Trust was growing, fragile but real, nurtured by shared vulnerability and mutual respect. As Astrid drifted off to sleep, she felt safer than she had since Eric's death, not just from physical threats, but from the deeper fear that she would face the future entirely alone. The runestone stood like a weathered sentinel at the crossroads, its ancient symbols carved deep into grey granite that had witnessed countless journeys begin and end. Moss filled the deeper grooves of the runes, and lichen painted abstract patterns across its surface in shades of green and gold. 4 paths branched away from this lonely monument north toward the coastal settlements, south into the deep forests, east back toward the lands they'd fled, and west toward mountain passes that led to unknown territories. Astrid leaned heavily against the stone, while Halvar studied each path with the methodical attention of a military strategist. 5 days of travel had taken their toll on her pregnant body. Her ankles were swollen, her back ached constantly, and the baby seemed determined to press against every uncomfortable spot he could find. But worse than physical discomfort was the weight of decision that hung over them like storm clouds. "My mother had a sister who married a man from Valdris," Astrid said, running her fingers along the carved runes. The symbols were older than memory, their meanings lost to all but the most learned skalds, but their presence felt somehow comforting. "It's 2 days' journey south, if the path hasn't been blocked by rockfall." Halvar nodded but didn't immediately respond. He'd been quiet since dawn, his pale eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with the vigilance of a man who'd survived too many ambushes to ever fully relax. The crossroads made him nervous, too many approaches, too many ways for enemies to converge on their position. "Do you think they'd welcome us?" he asked finally. "I don't know." Astrid's honesty carried the weight of someone who'd learned not to assume kindness from family. "Ingrid was always fond of me as a child, but that was years ago. And her husband, Thorvald, I barely knew him. He might not appreciate strangers arriving on his doorstep, especially with winter coming. And if they turn us away?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Astrid placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby's restless movement. The child would be born within weeks, perhaps sooner. They needed shelter, warmth, and the kind of safety that only came with community acceptance. But seeking refuge also meant risking another rejection, another painful reminder that she carried some invisible mark that drove good people away. "There are other options," Halvar said, misreading her hesitation as doubt. "The northern path leads to fishing villages along the coast. Strangers are more common there, less likely to be questioned too closely. We could claim to be traveling merchants, settle in for the winter." "And what would we trade?" Astrid asked with gentle irony. "We have little enough for ourselves, let alone to establish false credentials as merchants." I have silver, enough to buy us a place and time to decide our next steps. Astrid studied his profile, noting the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned his silver. That money represented years of fighting in foreign lands, blood spilled for causes that probably meant little to him now. The idea of spending it on lies and temporary shelter seemed to pain him in ways she was only beginning to understand. "The Western Path," she said quietly. "Where does it lead?" Halvar's expression grew thoughtful. "Into the high country, valleys where the old ways still hold, where a man's worth is measured by his actions rather than his birth or his past. It would be harder, especially through winter, but we'd be truly free there. Free to do what? Build something of our own." His voice carried a note of longing he probably didn't realize was there. A place where this child could grow up without whispers following him, where his mother's past wouldn't define his future. The baby chose that moment to kick particularly hard, as if voicing his own opinion about their destination. Astrid gasped and pressed her hand to the spot, feeling the sharp outline of what might have been an elbow or knee. "He's eager to be born," she said, managing a small smile despite the discomfort. "He?" Halvar raised an eyebrow. "Eric was convinced it would be a boy, said he could tell by the way I carried him." Astrid's expression grew distant. "We had names picked out, Magnus if it was a boy, Sigrid if a girl. Good, strong names that would serve a child well." "Magnus," Halvar repeated, testing the sound. "It suits a fighter." They settled into comfortable silence as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crossroads. Other travelers had passed this way recently, wheel ruts in the packed earth, horse droppings that were only days old, the remains of a small fire where someone had cooked a hasty meal. But they were alone now, wrapped in the peculiar isolation that comes with momentous decisions. "I keep thinking about what you said," Astrid murmured, "about building something of our own. What about it troubles you?" "Not troubles, frightens, maybe. For so long, I've defined myself by what I lost. Eric's widow, the cursed woman, the one who brought misfortune. To think of being something else." She shook her head. "It feels like betraying his memory." Halvar was quiet for so long that Astrid thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen. "In the eastern lands, I knew a man who lost his entire family to plague. For months, he spoke of nothing but joining them in death, but gradually, he began to heal. Not by forgetting them, but by finding ways to honor their memory through the life he still lived." "What happened to him?" "He became the finest healer in our company. Said his family's deaths had taught him the value of every breath, every heartbeat. Their loss became his purpose." Halvar's pale eyes met hers. "Sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to embrace fully the life they died to protect." As evening approached, they made camp in the shelter of the runestone itself. The ancient monument seemed to watch over them like a benevolent ancestor, its presence both comforting and mysterious. Halvar built their fire with practiced efficiency, while Astrid arranged their sleeping furs and prepared what remained of their food. "Tomorrow," she said as they shared their simple meal, "we take the Western Path." Halvar nodded as if he'd known all along what her choice would be. "It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is." Astrid's hand found his across the small space between them. "But I'm tired of running from the future. If we're going to build something new, let's build it where we can't be found by old fears." That night, as they lay under stars that seemed close enough to touch, Astrid felt the baby settle into unusual stillness. Perhaps he too sensed that tomorrow would bring them to a place where the past finally lost its hold and the future began in earnest. The runestone stood guard over their dreams, ancient symbols catching starlight like promises written in stone. The torn banner hung from Halvar's pack like a ghost of battles past, its once proud fabric now reduced to faded strips that fluttered in the mountain wind. The eagle emblazoned upon it had been the symbol of his war company, 30 good men who'd sworn blood oaths to stand together through whatever the eastern campaigns might bring. Now, Only Halvar remained to carry their memory, and even that fragment of cloth was slowly unraveling, thread by precious thread. They'd been climbing for 3 days since leaving the crossroads, following a path that seemed more suggestion than reality. The western route proved as challenging as Halvar had warned, winding through valleys where the sun barely penetrated and across ridges where the wind cut like blades. But it was beautiful in its harsh way, with views that stretched to horizons painted in shades of blue and gold, and streams that sang ancient songs as they tumbled toward distant seas. On the afternoon of their 6th day, they encountered other travelers for the first time since leaving Skjorn. A merchant caravan making its way toward the coastal settlements had paused to rest their horses beside a clear mountain lake. The sight of armed guards and loaded wagons brought instant tension to Halvar's shoulders, his hand moving unconsciously toward his sword hilt. "Easy," Astrid murmured, though she too felt the flutter of anxiety in her chest. They looked peaceful enough. The caravan master, a weathered man with silver threading his dark beard, approached them with the careful courtesy of someone accustomed to dealing with strangers. His eyes took in Halvar's size and bearing with professional assessment before moving to Astrid's obvious pregnancy with something approaching sympathy. "Well met. Travelers," he called out when they were still 20 paces away. "The road ahead is rough for those afoot, especially for a woman in your condition, lady. If you're bound for the coast, we'd welcome your company." Halvar studied the man's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. Years of warfare had taught him to distrust kindness from strangers, especially when he had someone precious to protect. But the merchant's offer seemed genuine, and the guards flanking him looked like honest sellswords rather than brigands. "We're traveling west," Halvar replied carefully. "Into the high country." "West?" The merchant's eyebrows rose. "There's nothing west but empty valleys and wolves, friend. Surely you don't mean to winter in such isolation, not with a child coming." "A child that will be born free," Halvar said, his voice carrying quiet steel. "That's worth more than comfort." The merchant studied them both with new understanding, recognizing something in their manner that spoke of people fleeing more than seeking. He'd seen enough refugees in his years of trade to know when not to press for details. "As you wish," he said with a respectful nod. "But before you continue, know this, there are bandits working the mountain passes. We lost 2 men to them just last week. Travel carefully and trust no one you meet on the road." One of the guards, a grizzled veteran with scars marking his sword arm, had been listening to the exchange with growing recognition. As the merchant turned away, the guard approached Halvar with something like awe in his weathered features. "Begging your pardon," he said quietly, "but aren't you Halvar Eriksson? The one they called the Phantom in the Eastern Wars?" Astrid felt Halvar tense beside her, his entire body going still in the way of predators suddenly aware of danger. The reputation that had made him feared in Skjorn was apparently known even among common soldiers serving merchant caravans. "I fought in the east," Halvar acknowledged carefully. "Fought?" The guard's voice carried reverence. "My lord, you were legend there. The battle at Volga's ford, they say, you held the bridge alone against 50 men, while the rest of your company escaped." "They exaggerate," Halvar said, but Astrid could hear the pain underlying his words. "No one escaped that day." The guard's expression shifted to understanding, recognizing the burden of survivors' guilt that marked so many veterans. "Forgive me, lord, I meant no offense. None taken, but I'm no one's lord anymore. Just a man traveling with his woman." The simplicity of that statement, his woman, sent unexpected warmth through Astrid's chest. Not his burden or his responsibility, but his woman, claimed with quiet pride before strangers who might judge such arrangements. After the caravan departed, they continued their climb in thoughtful silence. The encounter had reminded them both that Halvar's reputation preceded him wherever they went, carrying both protection and potential complications. Some would respect his legendary status, others might see it as a challenge to overcome. "Volga's ford," Astrid said eventually. Was it truly as the guard described? Halvar was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. We were retreating from a campaign gone wrong. The enemy had us outnumbered 3-1, and we'd lost too many good men to continue fighting. The ford was our only escape route, but someone had to hold the crossing while the wounded made it across. And you volunteered. I was the logical choice. Biggest, strongest, best equipped for a delaying action. His hand unconsciously touched the torn banner on his pack. The plan was for me to hold as long as possible, then swim the river and catch up with the company downstream. But something went wrong. Everything went wrong. Halvar's jaw tightened. The enemy brought archers. My men were cut down in the water before they could reach safety. I held the bridge, just as planned, but there was no one left to save. Astrid reached for his hand, squeezing gently. Yet you survived. Yes, I survived, while better men than me fed the crows. The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Sometimes I think that's my true curse. Not the death I carry, but the life I couldn't save. They made camp that evening beside a stream that sang with the voice of melting snow. As Halvar built their fire, Astrid watched him move with the fluid grace of a born warrior, every motion economical and purposeful. But she also saw the weight he carried, not just in his pack, but in his soul. The torn banner was more than a memento. It was penance worn where all could see. You saved me, she said quietly as they shared their evening meal. You saved us both. Perhaps that's why you survived, not to carry guilt, but to carry hope. Halvar's pale eyes reflected the firelight as he considered her words. Hope, he repeated, as if testing an unfamiliar concept. Hope, she confirmed, placing his hand on her belly where their child, for she'd begun thinking of the baby that way, stirred with evening restlessness. For all of us. As darkness fell around their small camp, Astrid found herself studying the torn banner in the firelight. It spoke of loyalty, sacrifice, and the bonds between men who'd faced death together. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask Halvar to tell her about those men, not the legend of the phantom, but the human stories of the brothers he'd lost. They deserved to be remembered as more than just casualties of someone else's war. Astrid's mother's brooch lay hidden beneath her clothing, pressed against her heart like a talisman. The silver piece bore the intricate knotwork of her grandmother's line, patterns that spoke of women who'd endured hardship with grace and raised children who honored their memory. She'd sewn it into the lining of her dress before fleeing Skjorn, one of the few treasures she'd managed to save from her former life. Now, as pain lanced through her belly with increasing frequency, she found herself clutching it through the fabric, drawing strength from generations of women who'd faced this same trial. The mountain weather had turned vicious overnight, bringing sleet that cut like tiny knives and wind that howled between the peaks with voices of the damned. They'd taken shelter in a shallow cave that offered protection from the worst of the storm, but the space was cramped, and the cold seemed to seep through stone itself. Astrid huddled deeper into her cloak, trying to find a position that didn't send spikes of discomfort through her swollen body. The baby had been restless for days, shifting and pressing until she felt as though her skin might split from the pressure within. But this morning brought something new, rhythmic tightening that stole her breath and left her gasping. "How far apart?" Halvar asked, his voice steady despite the concern written across his scarred features. Still irregular. Astrid managed between contractions, but stronger than before. They both knew what this meant. The child was coming, perhaps not today, but soon. Too soon, given their isolation and the storm raging outside their meager shelter. Halvar had delivered foals and helped with difficult carvings, but human birth was different, more dangerous for both mother and child, especially without proper midwives and warming rooms. "We need to find better shelter," he said, though they both knew their options were limited. The nearest settlement was days away, assuming the weather cleared enough for travel. "Not yet," Astrid said, breathing carefully through another wave of pain. These could go on for hours, even days. First babies are often slow to arrive. Halvar nodded, though his pale eyes remained worried. He'd seen enough of war to know that battles weren't won by hoping for the best. They needed plans, preparations, contingencies for when things went wrong. But this was one fight where his sword skills would be useless. As the storm continued its assault on their shelter, they settled into careful conversation, both trying to distract themselves from the growing tension of their situation. Astrid found herself sharing memories she'd kept locked away, stories of her mother's wisdom, her grandmother's strength, the long line of women who'd shaped her understanding of what it meant to endure. "My grandmother used to say that children chose their own time to arrive," she told Halvar during a lull between contractions. "That they waited until they knew they'd be truly welcome in the world. And what do you think this one is waiting for?" Astrid smiled despite her discomfort. "Perhaps he's waiting to be born free, as you said, in a place where his future isn't already written by other people's fears." The baby shifted at the sound of their voices, as if listening to plans being made on his behalf. Astrid had begun thinking of the child as completely hers and Halvar's, Eric's blood, but their shared hope. The guilt she'd expected to feel about this shift in loyalty never materialized. Instead, she felt a deep rightness about the life they were building together. "What will you tell him about his father?" Halvar asked, voicing a question that had haunted them both. "Everything good and true," Astrid replied without hesitation. "That Eric was brave and gentle and loved him before he was even born, that he died protecting what mattered most to him. And about us?" The question hung between them like a bridge half built. They'd avoided discussing the exact nature of their relationship, content to let it develop naturally without the pressure of definitions. But a child would need clarity about his place in the world, especially one born to circumstances as complex as theirs. "I'll tell him that sometimes the gods send unexpected protectors," Astrid said carefully. "That honor and love can grow from the strangest beginnings." Love. The word seemed to surprise Halvar, though perhaps not as much as it surprised Astrid to hear herself say it. "Is that so shocking?" she asked, though her cheeks warmed despite the cave's chill. "You've shown me more tenderness in these past weeks than many wives see in years of marriage. You've sacrificed everything familiar to keep us safe. If that isn't love, it's something so close the difference hardly matters." Halvar was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the storm beyond their shelter. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she'd rarely heard from him. "I stopped believing I was capable of such feelings years ago. The things I did in the East, the choices I made, they seemed to burn away everything soft in me. I thought I was nothing but scar tissue and sharp edges. And now? Now I wake each morning thinking about keeping you safe. I plan our route around your comfort rather than speed. I find myself imagining teaching this child to hunt, to fight, to be better than I ever was." His pale eyes met hers. "If that's not love, then I don't know what else to call it." Another contraction seized Astrid then, stronger than any before, bending her nearly double with its intensity. When it passed, she found Halvar's hand gripping hers with gentle strength, anchoring her through the pain. "Magnus," she gasped, using the name Eric had chosen. "I think Magnus is getting impatient." "Strong-willed," Halvar observed with something that might have been pride. Like his mother, the storm continued through the day, trapping them in their stone shelter, while Astrid's labor progressed with inexorable determination. The contractions grew stronger and closer together, each one bringing their child nearer to a world that offered no guarantees beyond the love of two people who'd found each other against impossible odds. As evening approached and the worst of the weather finally began to abate, Astrid felt a shift in her body that spoke of imminent change. The baby had dropped lower, pressing against her spine in ways that made sitting upright nearly impossible. But mixed with the discomfort was growing excitement. Soon she would hold Eric's son and see Halvar become the father he was meant to be. "Tomorrow," she said with quiet certainty, one hand pressed to her belly and the other clutching her grandmother's hidden brooch. Tomorrow, our real life begins. Outside their shelter, the storm's fury gradually gave way to the crystalline silence that follows mountain tempests. Stars began to appear between breaking clouds, shining like promises on a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. The bloodied cloak lay crumpled beside the cold ashes of a campfire, its fabric torn by brambles and stained dark with what could only be blood. Halvar knelt beside it with the stillness of a hunter who'd found fresh wolf sign, every sense alert for danger. The fabric was fine wool, dyed the deep blue that marked wealthy merchants or minor nobles. But it was the bronze clasp that made his blood run cold, a serpent twisted around a sword, the symbol of the Iron Wolf Company. "We need to leave," he said quietly, rising from his examination of the abandoned camp. Now, Astrid struggled to her feet, one hand braced against the rocky outcropping where they'd paused to rest. Her labor had intensified throughout the morning, contractions coming in waves that left her breathless and shaking. The idea of traveling in her condition seemed impossible, but something in Halvar's tone brooked no argument. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew. The tension radiating from him was different from his usual vigilance. This was the coiled readiness of a man who recognized specific rather than general danger. "The raiders who killed Eric," Halvar said, shouldering their packs with grim efficiency. "They're following us." The words hit Astrid like physical blows. "How can you be certain?" "This cloak bears the mark of their company. They were here yesterday, maybe less. And they're tracking us specifically. The footprints circle our old campsites, looking for signs of our passage." Astrid's mind reeled as implications crashed over her like avalanche stones. "But why? I have nothing they could want. Eric died defending grain stores, not treasure." Halvar's expression grew darker as understanding dawned. "Tell me about the night of the raid. Everything you remember about Eric's last hours. I don't understand. Please." His voice carried desperate urgency. "There's something we're missing, some reason they'd risk mountain passes and winter weather to hunt one pregnant woman." Astrid closed her eyes, forcing herself to relive memories she'd tried to bury. Eric came home just before sunset, agitated about something. He'd been talking to the other men about defense plans, but there was something else. He kept checking our few valuables, moving things around. "What things?" "Our silver, his grandfather's arm ring, my mother's jewelry." She paused, remembering, "and something wrapped in oiled leather that I'd never seen before. When I asked about it, he said it was insurance, something to protect us if the worst happened." "Where did he hide it?" "I don't know. He was secretive about it. Said it was better if I didn't know the details." A contraction seized her then, doubling her over with pain. When it passed, she found Halvar studying her with new intensity. "Astrid, think carefully. Did Eric ever mention the Iron Wolf Company by name? Any dealings with them? Any reason they might know who he was?" "No, She stopped, a half-forgotten conversation surfacing from memory. "Wait. There was a trader who came through Skjorn a few months before the raid. Eric spoke with him privately, seemed angry afterward. He mentioned something about old debts and bad blood." "What did this trader look like?" "Tall, lean, with a scar across his nose. He wore fine clothes, but carried himself like a soldier. Eric called him Ulf Grimson after he left. Halvar's curse was soft, but vicious. Ulf the Red. He's the Iron Wolf Company's second in command, their chief scout and negotiator. If Eric had dealings with him—" "You know these people?" Astrid's voice rose, despite her attempts to stay calm. "I know of them. The Iron Wolves aren't ordinary raiders. They're a military company that hires out to whoever pays best. Ruthless, organized, and they never leave debts uncollected." Halvar began scanning the surrounding terrain with the eye of a man planning defensive positions. If Eric took something from them, they'd hunt him to the ends of the earth to get it back. Another contraction hit Astrid, stronger than before, and she realized with growing horror that she was trapped between two impossible choices. The baby was coming, whether she wanted him to or not, but staying to give birth would mean facing the Iron Wolf Company while helpless. The image of raiders finding her in labor made her stomach clench with terror. What could Eric have possibly stolen that would be worth this much trouble? She gasped when the pain subsided. Gold, most likely, or information that could ruin someone powerful. The Iron Wolves don't work cheap, and they don't forgive easily. Halvar's tone was matter of fact, but she could see the calculations running behind his eyes. The question is whether they know you have it, or if they just suspect. I don't have anything. When they burned our home, I barely escaped with my life. Then maybe they think you know where Eric hid it. Either way, they're not going to stop hunting until they're satisfied. He paused, studying the abandoned campsite again. There's something else. This cloak, it's fresh blood, probably from last night. They had a fight with someone, maybe the bandits the merchant warned us about. Is that good or bad for us? Both. They're wounded, which might slow them down, but they're also angry, and angry men make poor decisions. If they catch up to us. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy between them. Astrid forced herself to stand straighter despite the growing pressure in her pelvis. How far behind are they? Hours, not days. The ashes are still warm, and the blood on that cloak hasn't fully dried. We have a small lead, but not much. I can't outrun them in this condition, Astrid said, stating the obvious truth they both dreaded. Every step is agony, and the contractions are getting stronger. Halvar was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all seemed impossible. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold certainty of a man making peace with necessary violence. Then, we don't run. We find defensible ground and make them come to us. You can't fight an entire company alone. I've done it before. His hand moved to the foreign blade at his hip, fingers tracing its familiar weight. The Phantom didn't earn his reputation by running from fights. That was different. You were younger, and you didn't have. She gestured helplessly at her swollen belly. I didn't have something worth dying for, he finished quietly. That changes everything. Another contraction gripped her then, and Astrid felt something shift deep inside her body. The baby was coming soon, perhaps within hours. The timing couldn't have been worse, but children chose their own moments, regardless of adult plans or dangers. There's a ridge ahead, Halvar said, studying the terrain with professional interest. Good sight lines, limited approaches, water nearby. If we can reach it before they catch up, and if I go into hard labor while you're fighting for our lives, then you do what women have done since the world began, he said, helping her gather their possessions. You bring our child into the world despite impossible odds, and trust that I'll keep you both safe while you do it. As they began their climb toward the ridge, Astrid felt the weight of her grandmother's brooch against her chest, and drew strength from that connection to women who'd faced their own impossible moments. Behind them somewhere, the Iron Wolf Company was closing the distance with each hour. Ahead lay a confrontation that would determine whether their growing love story would end in tragedy or triumph. But first, she had a child to deliver, and that ancient imperative overrode every other consideration. Whatever came next, Magnus would be born free, just as Halvar had promised. The rest they would face together, as they'd faced everything else, with courage drawn from love and determination forged in shared adversity. Halvar's warhorn lay coiled in his pack like a sleeping serpent, its carved bone surface worn smooth by countless campaigns. He hadn't blown it since Volga's ford, hadn't felt worthy to call upon the ancient traditions it represented. But now, as he prepared for what might be his final battle, the horn seemed to whisper of duty and honor, not to distant jarls or forgotten causes, but to the woman laboring behind him and the child fighting to be born. The ridge they'd chosen offered everything a defensive position should commanding views of three approaches, solid rock at their backs, and a spring that bubbled up through granite cracks to form a small pool. Halvar had spent the afternoon transforming it into a fortress, using nothing but determination and hard-won knowledge. Sharpened stakes now blocked the easiest climbing routes. Loose stones were piled where they could be quickly toppled onto attackers. Every advantage the terrain offered had been magnified through careful preparation, but it was the sounds behind him that demanded most of his attention. Astrid's labor had progressed with relentless inevitability throughout their climb, each contraction stronger than the last. Now she knelt on the furs he'd arranged in the most protected spot, breathing through pain that would have felled lesser women. Her face was pale with effort, but her eyes held the fierce determination of a mother preparing to fight for her child's life. "How much time do we have?" she gasped between contractions, though they both knew the question applied to multiple urgent circumstances. "Hard to say," Halvar replied, checking the edge on his sword for the dozenth time. "They'll reach the base of the ridge within the hour, but they'll need time to study our defenses before attacking." "And the baby?" Astrid's voice carried a note of barely controlled panic. The contractions were coming in waves now, each one bringing Magnus closer to a world that might explode into violence at any moment. She could feel her body preparing for the final stages of birth, muscles and sinews arranging themselves for the ancient dance of delivery. "Soon," she whispered, more to herself than to Halvar. "Very soon." Halvar abandoned his weapons check and knelt beside her, taking her hands in his scarred ones. "Listen to me carefully. When the fighting starts, you focus only on bringing our son safely into the world. Don't think about anything else, not the noise, not the danger. Nothing but Magnus. Can you do that?" "Our son," she repeated, finding strength in the simple possessive. "Yes, I can do that." "Good. And if something happens to me, nothing will happen to you." The steel in her voice surprised them both. "Nothing will happen to any of us. This child will not be born into tragedy." Halvar smiled, despite the gravity of their situation. "As you command, my lady." He returned to his preparations, but now they carried a different quality. Not the desperate measures of a man expecting to die, but the careful arrangements of someone determined to win. The horn at his belt seemed to pulse with anticipation, waiting for the moment when ancient calls to battle would echo across the mountains once more. Below them, movement caught his eye. 6 figures emerged from the tree line, moving with the coordinated precision of professional soldiers. Even at distance, their leader was unmistakable, Ulf Grimson, the Red Wolf himself, his scarred face visible beneath iron helm. The man who'd spoken to Eric in those final months, who'd set in motion the chain of events that led to this moment. "They're here," Halvar said quietly. Astrid nodded, though her attention was increasingly focused inward as her body prepared for the culmination of months of anticipation. The baby pressed down with each contraction, seeking the path to freedom that nature had ordained. Soon she would need to push, to work with her son's determination to be born despite the chaos surrounding them. "Tell me about the men you served with," she said suddenly, needing distraction from both the approaching danger and her intensifying labor. "The ones whose banner you carry." Halvar glanced back at her, understanding her need for human connection in this moment of extremity. "Bjorn was our smith, could forge a blade that would hold its edge through 3 battles. Olaf had a voice like thunder when he sang the old songs. Gunther could track a sparrow through a blizzard. Good men? The best. Brothers in everything but blood." His voice carried old grief but also pride. "They'd have loved you, and they'd have spoiled Magnus beyond reason." "They're here with us now," Astrid said with sudden conviction, "fighting beside you one last time." The notion should have seemed fanciful, but Halvar found comfort in it. Perhaps the dead did watch over those they'd left behind. Perhaps his fallen brothers would lend strength to his sword arm when the moment came to defend what mattered most. Below, the Iron Wolf Company had begun their ascent. They moved cautiously, testing each section of the path Halvar had prepared for them. His traps slowed their progress, but wouldn't stop them. These were experienced warriors who'd faced far worse than sharpened stakes and rolling stones. They would reach the summit eventually, and when they did, everything would be decided by skill and determination. Ulf wants to talk first, Halvar observed, watching the company's movements. He's holding his men back while he approaches alone. That's good, isn't it? Maybe. Or maybe he just wants to confirm what we have before he takes it. Halvar's expression hardened. Either way, it gives us time. Time they needed desperately. Astrid's contractions were coming in rapid succession now, each one accompanied by pressure that spoke of imminent delivery. She could feel the baby's head pressing down, seeking the passage that would bring him to light and air, and the love waiting to receive him. "Halvar," she called softly. I think it's time." He turned from his watch to find her face transformed by the ancient focus of women in labor. The pain that had marked her features throughout the day was still there, but now it was purposeful, directed toward the goal of bringing new life into being. "What do you need me to do? Just keep talking. Tell me about the life we're going to build together." As Ulf Grimsson climbed slowly up the ridge path, calling out offers and threats in equal measure, Halvar found himself describing a future he'd never dared imagine before meeting Astrid. A small farm in some peaceful valley where Magnus would learn to hunt and fight and grow into the kind of man his mother would be proud of. A place where scars healed and old nightmares faded, where love proved stronger than the weight of past mistakes. "I'll teach him to use a bow," Halvar said, one eye on the approaching raider and one on the woman bringing his son into the world. "And you'll teach him to be gentle with that strength. He'll have your courage and Eric's kindness," Astrid replied, bearing down as her body demanded. The best of both his fathers. The war horn at Halvar's belt seemed to sing silently in the mountain air, calling to ancient loyalties and forgotten oaths. But the strongest call was the one behind him, the sound of a woman fighting to deliver life, even as death climbed toward them with bloody intentions. "I can see the top of his head," Astrid whispered, wonder mixing with exertion in her voice. "Magnus is coming." Below them, Ulf Grimsson paused at the base of their final defensive position and called up in a voice that carried clearly on the thin air. "Halvar Eriksson, we know you're up there, Phantom. Time to discuss the debt your woman's husband left unpaid." Halvar drew his foreign blade, the steel whispering as it cleared the scabbard. The curved edge caught afternoon sunlight and threw it back like a signal fire, announcing his readiness for whatever came next. "Almost there," he murmured, though whether to Astrid or to himself, neither could say. Above them, storm clouds gathered as if summoned by the approaching confrontation, promising lightning and fury to match the human drama playing out on the rocky summit. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and distant battles. The raider chief's axe gleamed with wicked purpose as Ulf Grimsson crested the ridge, his scarred face split by a predatory grin. The weapon bore notches along its blade, marks of previous kills, trophies of a man who took pride in dealing death. Behind him, 5 more iron wolves spread out with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd fought together through countless battles. "Well, well," Ulf called out, his voice carrying mock joviality over the mountain wind. "The legendary Phantom, playing nursemaid to a pregnant woman. How the mighty have fallen." Halvar stood between the raiders and Astrid, his foreign blade held in a guard position that spoke of years perfecting the art of killing. But even as he focused on the approaching threat, part of his attention remained fixed on the sounds behind him. Astrid's breathing, increasingly rapid and focused, punctuated by soft gasps that told him their son's arrival was imminent. "State your business and be gone," Halvar said, his voice carrying the cold authority he'd once used to command battlefields. "You know our business, Phantom, the debt Eric the Hunter left when he died so inconveniently." Ulf's grin widened. £10 of silver stolen from our company coffers, plus interest, of course. I know nothing of any debt. Perhaps, but your woman does. Ulf's eyes shifted toward Astrid, who was trying to remain as quiet as possible despite the intensity of her labor. Eric was clever, I'll give him that. Waited until we were engaged elsewhere, then raided our temporary camp. Took the silver we'd earned from a particularly lucrative contract. Behind Halvar, Astrid felt another powerful contraction seize her body. The baby was coming now, whether she was ready or not, his head crowning as nature completed its ancient work. She bit down on a strip of leather to muffle any sounds that might distract Halvar from the deadly confrontation unfolding. Even if this tale were true, Halvar said carefully, what makes you think she knows where it's hidden? Because Eric loved her, Ulf replied with cruel insight. And men in love do stupid things like tell their wives where they hide their secrets. The first raider moved then, circling toward Halvar's left flank with the patient stalking of a wolf testing prey. Halvar tracked him with peripheral vision while keeping his primary focus on Ulf, recognizing the classic pattern of distraction and flanking that military companies use to overwhelm single opponents. Last chance, Phantom. Tell us where Eric hid our silver, and we'll make this quick and clean. Refuse, and well, Ulf shrugged eloquently. We'll have all the time in the world to persuade the woman after you're dead. Halvar's response was to shift his stance slightly, the movement subtle but recognizable to anyone who'd faced him in battle. The Phantom was done talking. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, the flanking raider lunging with his sword, while 2 others rushed the center, leaving Ulf and 2 more to watch for opportunities. It was a sound tactic against most opponents, but Halvar Eriksson hadn't earned his reputation by being most opponents. He moved like liquid death, the foreign blade tracing arcs through the air that seemed to bend reality around their edges. The flanking raider's sword thrust met empty space as Halvar spun away, his curved steel opening the man's throat in the same motion. Blood sprayed across the rocky ground as the raider collapsed, his life pouring out in crimson streams. The 2 rushing the center found themselves facing a whirlwind of controlled violence. Halvar's blade work was poetry written in steel, economical, precise, devastating. He parried one thrust while his pommel crushed another raider's nose, then reversed his grip to drive the curved point through leather armor and into the heart beneath. Behind him, lost in the focus of bringing new life into the world, Astrid felt the baby's head emerge fully. One more push, perhaps 2, and Magnus would breathe his first breath of mountain air. The sounds of battle seemed distant compared to the overwhelming imperative of birth, her body following instincts older than civilization. Ulf Grimsson cursed as he watched 3 of his men fall in less than a minute, their blood staining the stone where moments before there had been only the promise of easy victory. The stories were true, then the Phantom was every bit as deadly as the legends claimed. "Take him!" Ulf roared to his remaining men, hefting his notched axe. All at once, but Halvar was already moving, using the bodies of the fallen to screen his approach. His blade swept out in a lateral arc that forced 2 raiders to leap backward, buying him precious seconds to reset his position. This wasn't the wild berserker fury of northern warriors. This was the calculated savagery of a man who'd studied death until it became art. A thin cry pierced the air behind him, so different from the sounds of battle that every man on the ridge froze for a heartbeat. Magnus had arrived, announcing his presence to a world that suddenly seemed brighter for his being in it. "The child," one of the surviving raiders whispered, momentarily distracted by the miracle of birth occurring amid their deadly business. That moment of distraction cost him his life, as Halvar's blade found his ribs, sliding between them with surgical precision. 4 down, 2 to go, plus Ulf himself. The odds were improving, but the fight was far from over. Magnus's first cry rang across the mountain ridge like a clarion call to the gods themselves, clear and strong and utterly innocent of the violence surrounding his entrance into the world. That sound, more precious than silver, more powerful than any weapon, transformed everything it touched. The baby's voice spoke of hope and future and the continuation of life despite all attempts to snuff it out. Halvar felt the cry reach him like physical warmth, washing away the last vestiges of guilt that had haunted him since Volga's ford. Here was why he'd survived when better men died, not to carry shame, but to protect this moment, this woman, this perfect new life that demanded the world be better than it was. "My son," he whispered, the words carrying wonder even as he parried Ulf's axe with his curved blade. "My son is here." The declaration seemed to unlock something primal in Halvar's fighting style. Where before he'd been efficient and deadly, now he became transcendent. His sword moved with the fluidity of wind over water, each strike carrying the weight of absolute purpose. This was no longer about debts or silver or the violence of desperate men. This was about a father protecting his family. Ulf Grimsson found himself facing an opponent unlike any he'd encountered in 20 years of warfare. The Phantom's reputation had been built on skill and ruthlessness, but this was something beyond mere technique. This was love made manifest in steel and fury, guided by a will that would not bend regardless of odds. "Stand down!" Ulf gasped, as Halvar's blade traced a shallow line across his ribs. "We can make a deal." "The time for deals is past," Halvar replied, pressing his attack with relentless precision. "You threatened my family. There's no coming back from that." Behind them, Astrid cradled Magnus against her chest, marveling at the perfect features that were somehow both Eric's and uniquely his own. The baby's eyes were the pale blue of winter mornings, and his grip was strong enough to wrap tiny fingers around hers with surprising determination. Despite the chaos surrounding his birth, he seemed peaceful, as if he understood that he was surrounded by people who would die to protect him. "Look at him, Halvar," she called out, her voice carrying joy that transcended exhaustion and fear. "Look at our beautiful boy." The moment of distraction nearly cost Halvar his life, as one of the surviving raiders lunged from his blind spot. But the foreign blade moved of its own accord, intercepting the attack with the kind of precision that came from muscles trained to react faster than thought. The raider's sword flew from nerveless fingers as Halvar's pommel shattered his wrist, followed immediately by a thrust that ended his participation permanently. Only Ulf remained now, the red wolf backed against the ridge's edge with nowhere left to retreat. His notched axe wavered in hands that had begun to shake with the realization that he'd gravely underestimated his opponent. The silver that had seemed so important an hour ago now felt like a death sentence for foolish greed. "The debt," Ulf said desperately, playing his last card. "Eric stole from us. We have the right." "Eric's debt died with Eric," Halvar interrupted, his blade steady at Ulf's throat. "But your debt to us is just beginning." "What debt?" "The blood price for terrorizing a pregnant woman, the cost of threatening an innocent child. The payment owed for every sleepless night my woman spent wondering if monsters like you would find her." Ulf's eyes darted toward the baby, calculating odds he didn't like. "I could tell others where to find you. The Iron Wolf Company has long reach." "Had," Halvar corrected, "past tense, because the last of your company dies here today on this ridge." The final exchange lasted mere seconds. Ulf's axe swept up in a desperate attempt to break through Halvar's guard, but the foreign blade was already inside his reach, its curved edge finding the gap between neck and shoulder with surgical precision. The red wolf's eyes widened in surprise, before the light faded from them forever. Silence fell over the ridge like snowfall, broken only by the wind through the rocks and the soft sounds of Magnus discovering his own voice. Halvar stood among the bodies of his enemies, his blade dripping crimson, while behind him the woman he loved held the child he would raise as his own. "Is it over?" Astrid asked quietly. "It's over," Halvar confirmed, wiping his blade clean before sheathing it. "They'll never threaten you again." He knelt beside her, his battle-hardened features soft with wonder as he looked upon Magnus for the first time. The baby turned toward the sound of his voice with the unerring instinct of the newborn, tiny face scrunching as if trying to focus on the giant who would be his protector. "Hello, little warrior," Halvar whispered, extending one scarred finger toward Magnus's grasping hand. "Welcome to freedom." When tiny fingers closed around his with surprising strength, Halvar felt the last pieces of his shattered heart finally heal. The phantom was dead, buried beneath the love of a woman who'd seen past his reputation and the responsibility of raising a child who would know only protection and peace. "Our family," Astrid said softly, pulling Halvar down beside her so they formed a circle of warmth around their son. Finally complete. Above them, storm clouds parted to let through shafts of golden sunlight that illuminated the scene like a blessing from the gods themselves. The hearthstone at the center of their new home had been laid with ceremony befitting the foundation of a dynasty. Carved from the same granite where Magnus had been born, it anchored their dwelling like a promise written in stone, permanent, enduring, built to last generations. 3 years had passed since that bloody dawn on the mountain ridge, and the settlement they'd discovered in the hidden valley had welcomed them as the family they'd become, rather than the refugees they'd once been. Spring sunlight streamed through the open door of their modest hall, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits celebrating another day of peace. Outside, Magnus could be heard chattering to himself in the mixture of real words and happy nonsense that marked his exploration of language. At 3, he was already showing signs of both his father's, Eric's, gentle curiosity about the world and Halvar's quiet determination to understand how everything worked. Astrid paused in her weaving to watch through the window as Halvar taught their son to whittle. The giant's massive hands guided small fingers with infinite patience, showing Magnus how to follow the grain of the wood rather than fight against it. It was a lesson that applied to more than carpentry. Working with nature instead of struggling against it had become the principle that governed their entire life together. "Remember, little one," Halvar's voice carried clearly on the warm air. Magnus nodded solemnly, his pale blue eyes, so like his adoptive father's, focused with the intensity only children could bring to new learning. The wooden horse taking shape beneath his careful cuts would never win prizes for craftsmanship, but it was his, created with love and guidance from the man who'd claimed him as son without hesitation or condition. The settlement of Thorndale had been everything they'd hoped to find, a community small enough that strangers weren't automatically suspicious, prosperous enough that useful skills were valued over complicated histories. When Halvar had demonstrated his ability with weapons and Astrid had shown her talent for healing and midwifery, they'd been accepted with the pragmatic welcome that marked frontier communities. Here, what you could do mattered more than where you'd come from. Their home reflected the life they'd built together, practical but comfortable, with small touches that spoke of people who'd learned to treasure simple joys. Astrid's loom stood beside the hearth, its half-finished tapestry telling the story of their journey in threads of blue and gold. Halvar's weapons hung on the wall, kept ready but no longer needed for daily survival. Children's toys occupied places of honor alongside more serious household goods, evidence of how completely their priorities had shifted. "Mama, look!" Magnus burst through the door with the enthusiasm that marked all his entrances, holding up his carved horse for inspection. "Papa helped me make Sleipnir." Astrid accepted the wooden toy with appropriate gravity, examining it as if it were crafted by master artisans. "This is magnificent, my love. Sleipnir looks ready to carry heroes on great adventures. Will you tell me about Sleipnir's adventures tonight?" Magnus asked, climbing onto her lap with the casual confidence of a thoroughly loved child. "I will," she promised, smoothing his dark hair. "But first, help me understand what your papa has been teaching you about working with wood." As Magnus launched into an animated explanation of grain patterns and proper knife technique, Astrid caught Halvar's eye and smiled. This was the life they'd built from nothing, not perfect, but complete in ways that wealth or status could never provide. Their son would grow up knowing he was wanted, protected, and cherished by two people who'd chosen each other against impossible odds. Evening brought the ritual they'd established almost from the beginning, stories told by firelight, while Magnus nestled between his parents like a bridge connecting their different histories. Tonight, as promised, Astrid wove tales of Sleipnir's journeys through the 9 realms, while Halvar added details about the heroes who'd ridden the 8-legged horse. But gradually, the stories shifted toward more personal territory. "Tell about the mountain, baby," Magnus requested sleepily, using his own name for the tale of his birth. "Once upon a time," Astrid began, her voice taking on the rhythm of ritual, "there was a brave woman who climbed a very tall mountain while carrying a very special baby." "And the giant warrior?" Magnus prompted, knowing the story by heart, but wanting to hear it again. "The giant warrior protected them both," Halvar continued, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "He fought off wolves and bears and wicked men who wanted to hurt the mountain baby. But the baby was born anyway," Astrid confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of Magnus's head. "Because love is stronger than anything that tries to stop it." "And they lived happily?" "They lived happily," both parents said together, the words carrying the weight of daily truth rather than fairy tale ending. As Magnus drifted off to sleep between them, Astrid and Halvar sat in comfortable silence, each lost in reflection on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The hearthstone glowed with banked coals, its steady warmth a reminder of the permanence they'd created together. "Do you ever regret it?" Astrid asked quietly. "Leaving everything behind for us?" Halvar considered the question seriously, as he always did when she voiced the worries that occasionally surfaced, despite their obvious happiness. "I regret the years before I found you," he said finally. "I regret the time I wasted thinking I was only good for dealing death. But leaving Skjorn? Choosing this life with you and Magnus? Never. Even when the memories are difficult, especially then." His arm tightened around both of them. "The past taught me to recognize when I'd found something worth protecting. Without it, I might have let you walk away." Outside their hall, Thorndale settled into evening quiet. Inside, a family that had been forged in hardship and tempered by love prepared for another night of peaceful dreams. The hearthstone would keep burning long after they slept, its steady glow a promise that some foundations once properly laid would endure whatever storms the future might bring.